How the Game Boy Advance triggers you. 1. The cartridges are ridiculously small. 2. The original Game Boy Advance was big and all, and had a headphone jack. It ran on batteries, which was practically the only downside, but it didn't have a lit screen, so you couldn't play in the dark unless you bought a finicky accessory light. What the heck was that? And they never updated it either. They left behind the original model for a much smaller one, which is coming right now. May I introduce to you the better of the AGS 001s that I have. This one. I couldn't. I really don't want to show off the NES one that I have because it's really, really messed up. Anywho, so then they released this. What the heck is that? The screen is dark in the darkness. And look at how hard it is to record. Like, you have to be like this, and this is tilting the console forward. Oh yeah, and it can max out your adjustment on your phone so it doesn't focus correctly. It doesn't look right with this screen. But then they released another one that had a much smaller screen. Oh yeah, and also this one doesn't have a headphone jack, but it does have a rechargeable battery. Well, there was an accessory, but why? And then there was the Game Boy Micro, which I couldn't be bothered to buy, and I will never buy. As this thing was way too small, and I would probably lose it. This one got rid of the backwards compatibility completely, unlike this one that actually had it. Why? That made the Game Boy Micro, although it had a better screen, although it was a lot smaller than this one, the screen, and the system itself. That made the Game Boy Micro better, but it can only play Game Boy Advance games. So, although the Game Boy Advance library is very good and large, that's cutting off your Game Boy Color and Game Boy library. And then we move on to the definitive Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance SP AGS 101. Wow, what a name. That's the full name of the console. If you want to be actually, correct, it's just called the Game Boy Advance SP, but so is this one. What? Of course, the 101 went back to backwards compatibility and was a last-ditch effort in case the DS failed, which it didn't. And now onto the DS. A clunky little boy that is a big chunker of the DS family. The first one, and they were all like, oh, make it as bulky as possible. This one had somewhat worse of a screen than the 101, but you could get by with it, and it had a bigger screen, and it could also play, only GBA games, so again with the micro thing. Then came the DS Lite, a slightly smaller screen, better backlight, and of course you can also just play GBA games. And that's where it stops. That's literally it. They went off on the DS Lite. The reason the DS Lite had a GBA slot was actually for a few accessories, but you could get away with playing your Game Boy Advance games on there. But if you just have to play your Game Boy Advance games, there's an adapter for the Super Nintendo N64. And if you don't want to play your Game Boy Advance video packs, you can always use the Game Boy player on the Nintendo GameCube. Or Retron 5. I don't really think that there's that many new consoles that feature GBA capability that can play the Game Boy Advance video packs, but can play the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. But if you really have to play your Game Boy on a good screen, you can get an emulator in the ROMs. Or you can go the really, really rare way. And, the cartridges themselves aren't really rare. unless you're looking for specific ones that are rare. You can actually buy an adapter for Game Boy Advance cartridges that actually plays Game Boy in Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance for your computer. It plugs in via USB and plays your Game Boy Advance cartridges. I have no idea how it works because I don't have one, but yeah, I'm assuming it does the job. And it can also do GBA videos packs. But, I mean, the best way to do it is an emulator, but we're still having problems getting GBA video ROMs. So, yeah. And that's how the GBA triggers you. The original didn't have a backlight or front light and only had a finicky accessory that could fall out easily. The second model was better, but it didn't have a headphone jack like the original. But the real problem was, if you want to actually play GBA games with someone else, if you have one of these, the Game Boy Advance link cable can actually fall out very easily. Speaking of cables, the Game Boy Advance earbud adapter. What the actual heck is that? Of course, there's GBA video packs, but if you didn't want to go that way, there was another option, but the GBA video packs were obviously the better deal because, well, you could watch those all the time. But if you wanted to get really serious and watch TV for free, you could have gotten the Game Boy Advance TV tuner. Yep, it was designed for this model. It also works on the 101. But you don't need that. You can just get GBA video packs and it's basically the same experience. Because you can't really use the TV tuner these days, and plus you can't really get most of your favorite shows on free TV on the air these days because most companies have switched over to cable or they just aren't offering them on air anymore. But then again, it is free TV. That's it for now. Goodbye.